Monster Hunter has had plenty of successful games over the years, but World took it several notches up by becoming not only the most successful game in the series, but also the highest selling Capcom game of all time. This was achieved partly by releasing the game on modern platforms with a worldwide release, but World also streamlined many old or archaic aspects across the series, smoothing out various different systems and making Monster Hunter's gameplay more suitable for a wider audience. It was praised as a breath of fresh air for the series, and a long-awaited modernisation of Monster Hunter. Wilds is a direct successor to World and was arguably a massive success too, but this time, the critical reception was different. The game was blasted for being too easy, too simple, too streamlined. It was as if Wilds had utterly sacrificed any kind of roughness, friction, or even challenge the series was known for. World wasn't the first Monster Hunter game to streamline the gameplay, and Wilds isn't like this for no reason. Today, we're going to examine how Monster Hunter games have streamlined down the gameplay over the years, to what end, and how Wilds may have gone too far. So what exactly is streamlining? I would define it as the act of making a process faster, simpler, or just more efficient, often by simplifying things, removing unnecessary steps, or updating methods. Streamlining can be achieved with the help of new technology or know-how, as different techniques and ways of doing things change and become more optimized over time. For example, the new Super Mario Bros. Games would boot you back to the world map whenever you died in a level. If you wanted to keep going, you would have to head back into the level, which meant there were a lot of unnecessary loading screens. Several years later though, Super Mario Wonder simply keeps you in the level upon dying, automatically restarting you at your last checkpoint. You're only sent back to the map if you lose all your lives, which makes much more sense. The 3DS version of Ocarina of Time was a remaster that lightly updated the original game in clever ways. In the N64 version, you were often required to equip and unequip certain pieces of gear, such as the iron boots in the water temple, which let you rise and fall while submerged. This was often rather long, however, due to the slow speed of the menu in that game. The 3DS version not only has faster menus, but changed the iron boots into an item that easily goes into one of the relevant slots, allowing you to equip and unequip the boots with a single button press. Star Fox 64 is an on-rail shooter released in 1997, where you have to blast your way across several different planets as you travel through the Lilat system. You can boost and apply the brakes on the ship, but by timing these actions while quickly tilting the analog stick up, you can either somersault or turn around entirely in all range battles. The 3DS remake also allowed you to do this, but it mapped those unique actions to up and down on the D-pad respectively. The changes these games got were rather small, and I would describe them as quality of life additions. This can be defined as a change to a game mechanic or function that doesn't fundamentally change the gameplay, but streamlines different aspects surrounding it. Take the Star Fox example. Being able to press a single button to somersault doesn't really change the gameplay, as you still need to know when to perform the action and time it properly. It's not like the original input is hard either, but things are a lot simpler now. In regards to Ocarina of Time's iron boots, the water temple in that game is infamous for being a pain to navigate, and the iron boots combined with a slow menu in the original did not help. The menu changes in the 3DS remaster are a major quality of life addition that refocus the challenge of the temple solely on its actual layouts. Having to constantly open and close an unresponsive feeling menu was a frustration better left in the past. And with the 2D Mario games, you can't seriously argue that more loading screens were necessary to the experience. 9 times out of 10, if somebody dies in a level, they'd rather immediately retry it, so keeping them in the level upon death was a fantastic quality of life addition that reduced pointless waiting and maximised the time you spent actually playing the game. It's important for us to understand what a quality of life addition is, as well as what streamlining can do to a game. The later iterations or versions of these games either sliced away or eased up on different things considered to be unnecessary to the experience. The key word being considered, because it's not always objectively true that something is unnecessary. For example, the Ace Attorney series has you play as a lawyer, where you investigate crime scenes and then use what you gathered to defend clients in court. However, the scripted nature of these games often makes it rather easy to get stuck, because you'll have to do specific things to advance, especially in investigations. You have to point out different things in different environments, and often present them to people, and missing just one detail can leave you baffled as you struggle to work out how to progress the story. The 5th Ace Attorney, titled Dual Destinies, was focused on easing this aspect up, and streamlined much of the process of investigating. For example, in the evidence menu, there's now a notes pad that gives you a rough idea of what you should be doing next. Additionally, when investigating, interactable parts of the environment will be highlighted differently by the pointer, and a different indicator will display when you've already checked something. but they also made the controversial decision to completely remove the ability to examine environments unless there was an investigation going on. In the 2D Ace Attorneys, you can examine anything you want, whenever you want, but the developers may have believed that this would confuse players who are stuck on where to go next. As a result, Dual Destiny streamlines the experience by limiting what you're allowed to investigate, but this also limits the amount of things to pay attention to in the environments, not to mention potential dialogue between characters on those different things. It made the game simpler to go through, but also far less interesting than it could have been, and subsequent entries actually walked it back and have this feature again. And then there are games that have taken the concept of streamlining and quality of life way too far, such as the Majora's Mask remake for 3DS. Unlike Ocarina of Time, this one had a ton of changes that resulted in a drastically different experience. Majora's Mask has you attempt to save the world in only 3 days, and with the ability to control time you can either slow it down, skip ahead, or ultimately rewind to the start in order to delay the apocalypse and sort out all the problems in Termina. Time in this game is deeply important, as NPCs in this world follow a schedule and different things are guaranteed to happen across the 3 days. You're encouraged to reset repeatedly in order to learn them all, which is important for side quests. The 3DS remake had changes, such as being able to save whenever you wanted instead of only at resets, or being able to skip ahead a precise number of hours instead of only in 6-hour chunks, which eased the amount of time you would spend waiting during time-critical side quests. Those are good changes, the others are more contested. Every time you talk to an NPC, the 3DS version aggressively interrupts you with a notebook on the precise schedules, timings, and locations. This feature was in the original, but far less detailed, and so the 3DS version gives you less to actively figure out while also breaking the pacing. NPCs in the main town will also approach you with unsolicited advice, which more often than not will spoil something you rather would have figured out on your own. Bosses were homogenized and have giant eye weak points that bulge out, essentially making their fights more static and boring, especially in comparison to the original where they were more freeform. Different mask transformations had their movements simplified and are now much more simple but less fun to control. I won't go into all these changes. There's quite a famous video that discusses why this remake was so controversial for people, but it is a game that demonstrates how streamlining can go too far and why. Because Majora's Mask is a game that the Zelda creators weren't entirely satisfied with, despite it being acclaimed by many. The remake was essentially them fixing what they believed to be the game's shortcomings, but what they considered to be flaws with the original were not seen the same way by fans of the original, and it was all streamlined down, resulting in a simpler, but less interesting and subjectively worse experience. Sometimes streamlining can help to cut back on obtuse mechanics that bring down the experience, but other times it involves reducing or simplifying things that did make the game quite special, even if the mechanics were a little rough and unpolished, or resulted in people finding difficulty in progressing. It can benefit games to have a little bit of friction in different places, something for players to push back against, as it can create a far more memorable experience. Doing away with excessive loading screens, lengthy menu navigations, and somewhat precise inputs can be seen as a net improvement to the game. Aggressively handholding players on the other hand, or outright removing other mechanics so they don't get stuck or struggle as much as they used to, can make things a lot worse. Not all streamlining changes serve the same purpose, and they can break experiences just as much as they improve them. So that's the rundown on streamlining. What does it have to do with Monster Hunter? If you're watching this video, you're at least aware of the Monster Hunter games and have more than likely played them. The main appeal on the surface is fighting large bosses, which tend to have fairly complex movesets and large health pools, making fights last longer than in the average video game. But there's more to Monster Hunter than that. The main gameplay loop for the first 13 years had you accepting quests from the main hub, and heading out into large locales that would essentially be one giant map split into several mini distinct arenas, connected by loading zones. You'd primarily do this to hunt a monster, but while exploring the locales you were also heavily encouraged to gather items, mine for ore, and even collect bugs, which were all arguably as important. Both hunting and gathering will grant you materials to forge armor and craft items that will help you not only hunt better, but push back against several harsh mechanics of Monster Hunter. Monsters have dangerous abilities. They can cause tremors in the ground, roar to stun you in place, they can poison or paralyze, freeze and set on fire. They can totally resist your attacks, and often have unique strategies that simple combat skill on your part couldn't thwart. That's not to mention harsh temperatures of the deserts, mountains, tundras and volcanoes. But the gear you forged and the items you crafted help to negate at least some of those factors, allowing you to push back on those harsh mechanics and have an easier time overcoming the monsters. So I would say that the core appeal of the Monster Hunter games came not just from hunting the bosses, but also doing the necessary legwork to negate as many opposing factors as possible that would normally get in your way, resulting in them being reduced and the hunts becoming easier. As I said, if you're watching this video, then you're more than likely aware of all this, but it bears repeating because while beloved, this gameplay structure was arguably hindered by tons of odd gameplay choices. For a long time, the Monster Hunter series had a reputation for being clunky and somewhat rough to play, backwards in a lot of areas, and this stayed consistent for 13 years. Recently, I've been playing Monster Hunter Freedom, which is a handheld-defined version of the first Monster Hunter game for the PSP. It's an interesting time. The segmented areas are rather annoying to travel through, as the loading screens will momentarily take you out of things, making traversal a stuttery time. Item consumption is really weird. You can't cancel an animation once it's begun. Drinking potions will have your character flex their arms, leaving them vulnerable for monster attacks. Speaking of, a lot of them are quite frankly unfair. They can charge instantly, with no telegraph whatsoever, which is also the case for their other attacks like tailspins. It can make fighting them a really unpredictable time. Now, if you have played any of the older games, you might have noticed something odd about what I have described with Freedom. All these aspects are present in every Monster Hunter game released from 2004 to 2017. Freedom Unite, Try, Generations Ultimate. The general gameplay, things like segmented areas, monster attacks, and item consumption stayed the same for that entire time period. This might be because for that entire time period, Monster Hunter largely stayed on the same generation of hardware. The PS2, PSP, Wii and 3DS are not entirely different from each other in terms of raw power, which made huge revolutions somewhat difficult. But a lot of the smaller aspects were changed or updated, and as such, a game like Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate, while having the exact same structure as the earlier entries, can feel so different compared to them. Being one of the earliest games in the series, Freedom lacks a lot of the streamlined changes of the later games, and therefore makes for a great baseline to explore how Monster Hunter subtly streamlined the gameplay in minor ways over the years. In Freedom, gathering, mining or carving spots are not indicated at all. This was changed in Try. For a long time, you had to press the gather button for each individual item, but GU finally allowed you to hold it down. Camera controls in Freedom are rather limited too. You can move it left or right, but vertical movement only allows for fixed angles, which can feel awkward. There was also no lock-on as seen with many other 3D action games, which made keeping the camera trained on the monsters quite hard. 3 Ultimate added a feature that allowed the camera to snap to a monster with a single button press. It wasn't a total lock-on, but it did really help, and the next entry, Monster Hunter 4, allowed for free vertical and horizontal movement. Generations Ultimate upgraded that to a full 360-degree camera. When going out on a quest in Freedom, you have to be conscious of what you place in your inventory before departing. This is because the end quest rewards would go directly into your pouch, which often means you have to pick and choose what you want to give up. But Freedom Unite allowed you to send them straight back to your box at home. Speaking of the item box, there's not much space in Freedom, and several items only stack up to 10. There is a very small and hard limit on what you're allowed to keep, forcing you to spend your resources frequently to create space. Later games let items stack up to 99 and allowed for more box pages, which allowed you to keep far more items. Monster Hunter Freedom has a farm that allows you to manually gather items while in the village, which wasn't actually in Monster Hunter for the PS2, but later games like 4 and Generations heavily streamlined this feature, resulting in it eventually becoming just a menu that you collect items from. When taking a hit in these games, you're invincible while on the ground. You were not allowed to decide when to get up. It would happen automatically, which often put you in more danger. Starting with 4 Ultimate though, you could delay your get up, which added a bit of strategy to the whole thing. Getting up later could either ensure your safety, or put you in an even worse position, depending on how you played your cards. I could discuss even more changes if I wished to, but overall, they made the later games a lot simpler, less obtuse, and more forgiving in a lot of aspects, which made them smoother to play and easier for people to get into. The interesting thing about a lot of these changes is that because the raw power of the consoles roughly stayed the same, a lot of the changes we discussed weren't done because of technology advancements, but rather the developers deciding to streamline the game on their own. Monster Hunter Freedom could have had more item box space, faster gathering, or a proper 360-degree camera if they had decided to at the time, but those changes instead came later. That's not to say nothing came from new technology though. The 3rd generation brought about enhanced visuals and animations. The 4th generation overhauled player movement and map design, and both of these upgrades helped to modernize the game feel. Some of the streamlining has been controversial. Like with Majora's Mask, a lot of Monster Hunter fans do love the extreme roughness of the older games. In fact, while this tends to be understated nowadays, Monster Hunter even before World was a very successful and popular series. These games were not by any means hated or infamous, in fact quite the opposite. The so-called clunkiness was merely something else to overcome in the pursuit of taking these monsters down, and often added to the challenge. For example, the infamous potion flex. Sure, it could leave you in harm's way because of how long it was, but that simply meant you had to look for the right opportunities to heal, such as by recognizing when a monster is about to perform a lengthy attack. Even though a lot of people disliked the flex, many others saw the value in it as the legitimate balancing device that prevented healing from being an easy, free action. So when other difficult aspects were sanded away, it did occasionally cause controversy. The farm getting reduced to a mere menu in later games, for example. Something was kind of lost there. Having to go to a physical location and gather the items yourself, upgrade the place and watch it grow, this is a very different experience to just pressing buttons with an NPC. Sure, it's now way faster and you can collect so much more items, but at what cost? On the other hand, some controversies were totally asinine. The addition of the target camera in 3 Ultimate was decried by some who believed it would make the game easier. And technically it did, there's no denying it. Having a button that quickly centers the camera on a monster saves you the trouble of having to manually move it yourself. That does remove some of the challenge. However, just like with the iron boots and the faster menu in Ocarina of Time 3D, I would argue that this addition did not really compromise the actual core challenge of the games. We should be focused on taking down the monster, not wrestling with shoddy camera controls just to look at them. Like in Ocarina 3D, this addition helped focus the challenge on what actually matters, and this is true of the many other minor incremental changes made to these games over time. But as Monster Hunter's core audience grew, and the series moved to stronger hardware, things began to change. The streamlining took on an additional purpose, beyond merely simplifying the games. In 2013, series producer Ryozo Sugimoto bluntly said that by that point, Monster Hunter had not been an enormous success in the West yet, and that increasing their reach over there would be a challenge. Monster Hunter for years had a majority Japanese audience, despite Capcom releasing the majority of games worldwide. The goal wasn't for the audience to be mostly centralized in that one nation, it just kind of happened. There was something about the Monster Hunter games that really appealed to Japan, but not overseas, which meant that it wasn't totally clear what kind of changes would be needed in order to target the West, while also taking care to not fundamentally compromise what Monster Hunter was. One of the key ingredients in appealing to a worldwide audience is localization, which is the process of trying to make a product or service more suitable for a different region. For video games, this usually involves translating character dialogue in a way that makes sense and is entertaining for overseas audiences, which is often easier said than done, considering all the cultural differences they have to account for. Foreign voice actors are often hired to record new audio. User interfaces often need to be altered to account for different languages too, as Japanese kanji tends to be quite concise. It's more than just a simple translation, and often requires lots of back and forth between international departments. Back in the day, it was extremely common for a game to be released first in Japan, then several months later in the USA, and then even later in Europe, and this was the case with a lot of old Monster Hunters. Although Monster Hunter's Western audience was small, it was steadily growing. This became noticeable with Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate. If you recall, this was the game that introduced the target camera feature, and that was primarily due to Western feedback. Monster Hunter's historically bad camera controls were a common complaint, and while 3 Ultimate didn't really change them, this new feature meant that there was something of a fix. Sugimoto said that they weren't yet sure how to start appealing to the West, but that didn't mean they weren't slowly trying and succeeding. 3 Ultimate was widely praised by review outlets for having charming and funny dialogue, but also criticised for things like the tutorials being long, bad, and confusing, which naturally puts some people off. Regardless, the game's localization being praised was a sign for Capcom to begin investing more into the process, especially for Monster Hunter's next game. To reiterate, most Monster Hunter games had been translated and published worldwide in the past, but the fourth main entry was not one of them. Capcom instead opted to bring the expanded version for Ultimate worldwide. This time the localization lead, Andrew Alfonso, was able to join the main development team for the duration of the localization, and therefore was able to suggest more drastic changes compared to prior games. One such change related to the tutorials. There were quite a lot in the game, and Alfonso reckoned that Western players wouldn't really like them, seeing it as unnecessary hand-holding, treating the player like they wouldn't be able to understand anything by default, and ultimately getting in the way of them hunting the monsters. And he had good reason to believe this, considering the widespread criticism of 3 Ultimate's tutorials being boring. But there was also a very infamous localization change for that game. Non-Japanese versions of 3 Ultimate gave hunters a bonus 50 defense points by default, done in fear of overseas players finding the game too hard. Instead, it made them feel condescended to. The bonus defense was mandatory and couldn't be turned off, and even today is one of the most common criticisms of that game among more serious players. Monster Hunter's Western audience actually skewed older than in Japan, with 3 Ultimate's main player base estimated to be between the ages 19 to 34, very likely a group already familiar with video games. Alfonso's belief was that most of these people would rather reach the actual monsters and learn through experience rather than sit through a bunch of lectures. This proved a problem with Monster Hunter 4 as, being for the Nintendo 3DS, it was designed for a very younger audience. As such, there was a lot of tutorial dialogue, and at the end of each conversation, the instructor would ask you if you wanted to read the dialogue again. This option defaulted to yes, which Alfonso believed to be a serious problem, as this type of conversation occurred 80 times in the game. If Western players mashed through the dialogue to breeze through the tutorials, they'd more than likely accidentally hit yes, and have to hear it all again, which would very much frustrate them. So he appealed to director Konami Fujioka, and was not only able to get the option removed entirely, making it easier for people to mash through dialogue, but also reduce the total tutorial dialogue in the overseas versions and add an option to fast forward and skip dialogue entirely with a different button press. That's one of the many changes made to streamline the game specifically for overseas players. Many of them, however, made it into every version of the game. One such change is the font. In 3 Ultimate, the text was fine for the Wii U but rather poor for the 3DS, as highlighted by players and critics. So the localization team appealed to Capcom to find a new font for the next game that would be better suited for the platform, and it took them around a month to find a new one. When creating a new save in 4 Ultimate, you can choose to reduce the amount of tutorial messages you get, which is perfect for returning Monster Hunter players. Alfonso and his team were the ones who suggested this feature, and lead designer Yuya Tokuda requested them to figure out which dialogue text was absolutely necessary and which wasn't. Alfonso assigned one of the localization project managers to go through them all, and in the final game, selecting no on that screen will skip otherwise mandatory conversations on mechanics that are fairly easy to figure out. For example, if you were to select yes, in one of the first missions, the guild mom will interrupt you to explain how jumping attacks work. Selecting no will skip that altogether, as well as many other would-be mandatory conversations. But the localizers did keep new and inexperienced players in mind. Hot and cool drinks to offset temperature will always be found in the supplies box in the relevant locales, even on quests that wouldn't normally provide supplies. This was a localization request, and helps people who forgot those items or perhaps didn't closely read the quest description. However, there were also some requests that didn't make the cut at all. For example, the early game has multiple different tutorial quests for you to gather different items. Alfonso and his team suggested combining these into one singular quest, shortening the tutorial and allowing people to reach the meat of the game much faster. Another suggestion was to add more details to the monster list in the hunter's notes, including tips for taking them down and a weak point chart. Both of these suggestions were shot down, but not necessarily due to disagreements, but timing. Some of these suggestions were a little too big to be implemented at that direct stage of development. 4 Ultimate was a pretty major success. It did particularly well outside of Japan, where it sold over 1 million copies there alone, a series first. Capcom partially credited this success to the game's localization, which I think can't really be denied. Even outside of tutorials, the game's writing is especially praised, often for things that aren't present in the Japanese text, such as character writing choices. The localization really helped onboard new players without babying returning or experienced ones, done by successfully streamlining down unnecessary tutorials and fluff. And this wasn't just due to smart suggestions from the localization team, but also the core Monster Hunter developers listening to them and implementing many of their ideas. For Ultimate doing so well in the West, arguably marked a major turning point for the series' main target audience, one that would have major effects on the future of Monster Hunter. 4 Ultimate released in early 2015 for overseas markets, but by then, development for the next main entry, Monster Hunter 5, had been going on for almost 2 years, and Capcom had decided that, rather than the 3DS, the next main entry should be developed for mainstream consoles. The PlayStation 4 and Xbox One were roughly 2 whole generations stronger than the Wii and 3DS, which would allow the developers more freedom to achieve their vision for the series. 4 Ultimate's lead designer, Yuya Tokuda, was working on this game as director, while Konami Fujioka was serving as executive art director. Capcom's goal with this entry was to take advantage of this multi-generational hardware leap to make a Monster Hunter that could depict a living, breathing world, but also one that could heavily appeal to the wider world. Henceforth, this game was dubbed Monster Hunter World. Earlier I talked about the gameplay of the older games not drastically evolving, perhaps in some parts due to the hardware they were working on not really advancing far in terms of raw power. But as I also said, it wasn't always technology holding them back. Capcom were very cognizant that overhauling any major part of the gameplay would mandate several other changes. In an interview with US Gamer in 2015, Fujioka was asked if Monster Hunter would ever fully ditch vestigial elements that were born from hardware constraints, namely the segmented maps. These were always a fairly contentious part of Monster Hunter and a major obstacle for people who wanted to like the games. Having your traversal get interrupted frequently was bothersome, especially as more and more seamless exploration games hit the market. Fujioka had an interesting response. One thing we have to be careful about is not changing what makes Monster Hunter Monster Hunter. We want people to experience and enjoy what makes Monster Hunter good, and at least as far as the current situation goes, the gameplay in Monster Hunter very much is based on this idea of having segmented areas you manage fighting against the monsters in. Changing that right now is something that wouldn't quite work. For instance, part of the reason the segmented map is important is that it's very much part of the gameplay. Let's say you're fighting against a monster in a particular area and you're almost dead. If you can make it to the exit of that area, you can get out of harm's way, and at least heal yourself while the monster is in another area. There's a reward for players who can successfully take this risk. That's very much ingrained in the base of the gameplay right now, so the reason we haven't changed that yet is because, if we are going to change something like that gets down to the very roots of the game, if we're going to change Monster Hunter so that it basically features one giant contiguous area, then we really have to reformulate and rethink everything so it works correctly. The Monster Hunter developers had obviously thought about this in the past quite thoroughly. There were risks such as ditching highly important aspects of the series purely for the sake of modernization, and so care had to be taken with these decisions as to not ruin the entire game. With Monster Hunter World being a multi-generational leap, there was now a major opportunity to finally overhaul many long-time conventions of the series. As such, this game did the most amount of streamlining of any Monster Hunter game ever, in addition to many other changes that had never been made before. I think it would be prudent to differentiate the types of changes these games have gotten. I've chosen to split them into two. The first is a quality of life change, aka QOL, more or less what we discussed in the streamlining chapter. This is when a mechanic or function is changed to be simpler without truly altering the gameplay to any major degree. Most of the changes that prior Monster Hunter games got could be classified as this. The second type of change is an overhaul. This is a substantial alteration that affects the game significantly. The tricky thing is that an overhaul can, and often has, been initially described as a quality of life addition by many, but you can tell them apart because overhauls usually have a ton of knock-on effects. A lot of the changes made to Majora's Mask 3D can be seen as overhauls. In regards to Monster Hunter, let's begin with the biggest thing Monster Hunter World changed. After 13 long years, locales were now one large connected sandbox. This was an overhaul for certain, as it had many different knock-on effects and changes made to compensate. For example, locales were now much bigger to accommodate this shift, with a larger surface area than the older games. Due to the larger size of the locales, you can now create different subcamps around the map and skip travel to them when not in combat. Monster tracking was also overhauled. In the older games, you had to throw a paintball at the monster, which would mark their location on the map for a while. In World, they instead leave physical tracks that upon collecting will allow these bugs called scout flies to lead you to their location. After a few hunts, they'll automatically be marked, and the scout flies will lead you to them immediately. In the older Monster Hunter games, maps were a physical item that you had to collect in order to see the layout of the area. In World, they're permanent, with the only caveat that you have to unlock individual segments through exploration. This also applies to tools, as pickaxes and bug nets no longer have to be carried, nor do they break. You also have a bigger field pouch that allows you to gather even more items. Gathering is now so much faster, and gathering points respawn faster too. Scout flies will also mark them out and make them glow. In the older games, when combining two items to make a new one, the combinations would often fail, and you had to offset this with a series of items known as the Book of Combos to increase their chance. But in World, there is no longer a need for them, as combinations cannot fail anymore. In fact, some items will even automatically combine. Collecting honey while potions are in your inventory will automatically create mega potions, for instance. Another major change is that not only can you change your armor and weapons from subcamps while out in the field, but also deposit and restock items, which means inventory space or running out of potions mid-hunt is no longer a concern. These are good changes made to smooth out the gameplay and simplify things such as exploration or gathering. But world streamlining goes even beyond that. Every aspect of Monster Hunter was re-examined and altered. For example, previous games had separate single-player story-focused campaigns and multiplayer ones that were much longer and had the bulk of the content. People who wanted to play the game with their friends exclusively were not often fans of this, as the single-player campaign often gated critical unlockables, and if they were going to play Monster Hunter, it would much rather be with their friends. World combined these two campaigns into one, allowing the entire story to be experienced with others. The game was also designed so that quests could be joined even after they had begun, which wasn't the case in the older games. These overhauls mandated another change. In the older games, monster health was fixed for hub quests, with the intention that multiple people would undertake them. This would be a bit of a problem if you were on your own, however, as it meant hunts would take way longer than you wish they would. In World, monster health will scale depending on the amount of players on a quest. It will be a set number if there's one player, and then increase if there's 2 or 4. In addition to all this, when out on a quest, you can send out an SOS flare, which will basically convert a single player quest into a multiplayer one. This creates a temporary hunting party, which disbands immediately afterwards, drastically streamlining Monster Hunter's multiplayer experience. The story itself was also more streamlined. The older games had a system where each quest rank had a set of key quests you had to complete in order to unlock a special urgent quest. Key quests could be shared among players, but only the host could complete an urgent, which required a hunting party to repeat the urgent 4 times to raise everyone's rank. World's quest structure was designed so that instead there was a single highlighted story mission that would unlock the next, which streamlined and condensed the process of going through the game. And if you needed to do the quest and had joined somebody else's, it would count as complete for you, eliminating the need to repeat it. And then of course there's combat streamlining. Remember the flex? It's gone now, and pretty much all item usage or consumption can be cancelled at will. Potion drinking, steak gobbling, weapon sharpening. In fact, you can now walk or run while consuming many items, which makes healing much easier. There's also a neat little radial menu to easily access items instead of endlessly scrolling through the traditional menu. So during the heat of combat, you can simply flick the right analog stick in a certain direction and immediately use an item. After performing an attack in the older games, you could roll forwards, left or right. This means that if you committed to an action, there would be no easy way to back out of it. But World lets you dodge backwards. It's much slower and delayed, but it does help you back out of the way of enemy attacks. Even the weapons receive tons of options to make them more versatile. Greatsword received a tackle to power through enemy attacks, making it less reliant on dodging and somewhat offsetting its slow walking speed as a critical weakness. Longsword got a built-in parry. Charged Blade has a sliding attack for better mobility. There were other differences too, such as the Dual Blades Demon mode having the hunter wield the blades in a reverse grip and running much faster. Or better yet, the bows and bow guns having modernised controls and thus playing much more like contemporary shooters. The user interface was also streamlined. Health and stamina bars will now appear smaller when out of combat in order to clean things up. World was the first game to accurately display weapon sharpness degradation, helpful for knowing how much you have left before you need to bring out a whetstone. Damage numbers on weapons were also added, allowing you to easily see how strong your attacks were. In the past, this was represented by large and small cartoonish blood splatters, but World's method was much more precise. Optional too, since you were able to turn them off. Another quality of life change is that there's now optional weapon guides that can be displayed on the top right of the screen. They update in real time depending on what combo you're pulling off, and really help you understand what your weapon can actually do. The hunting horn even has a song display, a massive help for those who struggled with song memorization. And if that's not enough, World also added a training area for people to freely try out their weapons on barrels and pillars with no restrictions or consequences. Forging and upgrading systems were changed around too. There's now an in-game wishlist to easily keep track of what materials you might need to craft weapons and armors. You get alerted whenever you collect the right materials too. It's now far easier to preview equipment. In the older games, there were separate tabs for chest, arms, waist, which made forging a singular set rather awkward. In World, it's all listed like this, which is much more convenient. You can also preview how a set might look on your character with other pieces, which is helpful for fashion hunting. Weapon trees are now also visible for the first time. No more having to blindly guess where the weapon you're upgrading might eventually lead to, and if you do make an upgrade you regret, you can roll it back and get the materials refunded, at the cost of Zenny. There's some fantastic changes there, but there were also more overhauls in regards to the armor skill system. In the older games, an armor skill would be triggered when enough points across all equipped pieces totaled to 10, and then potentially enhanced at 15 and even 20 and so on. This meant that mixing and matching pieces required a little bit of maths, and that it wasn't always easy to just slot in a new skill. Furthermore, some skills could cause negative effects when their points went into the minuses, triggering at -10 and then potentially getting worse at -15 and so on. For example, you can negate stun for 15 points of anti-stun, but -10 will double the total duration. Things like that. World eliminated negative skills, and instead overhauled the whole system into something more modular. A single skill point now triggers the skill, and then you can add more points to enhance it. No more mildly tricky maths. This made creating mix sets much easier, and with decorations, it was also really easy to add in extra skills without having to overhaul everything. Monsters were also drastically changed. They now have different habits and behaviours and move from area to area more dynamically. A more interesting change is that the old 40-degree turnaround animations from the older games are a thing of the past. They can now turn into their attacks immediately, drastically altering the pace of every fight. They can also stay aggroed on you, even if you leave the area, due to a loading screen no longer dividing you. However, previously instant attacks were now way more telegraphed. Insta-charges were a thing of the past, and even that old infamous tailspin now had the monster visibly get ready to perform the attack. It made monsters much more fair. Finally, the Hunter's notes were totally revamped, in a way that's just like what was suggested during Full Ultimate's localization. In World, they list weak points, elemental weaknesses and drop rates. They're much more detailed with these handy little charts, helping people learn more about the monsters, and ultimately, getting better at Monster Hunter. Monster Hunter World is more or less a series reboot in all but name, a total gameplay revolution that also provides a fresh starting point for new players. Rathalos was even featured on the overseas box art because of his icon status, a move made to appeal to those unfamiliar with the series, and World very much succeeded at this. Tsujimoto, Fujioka and Tokuda's bets paid off massively. It quickly became the fastest selling Monster Hunter game, shipping 5 million in its first month. By comparison, Full Ultimate sold 4 million across its entire lifetime. World then went on to become the most successful Capcom game of all time, with over 25 million copies sold across PlayStation, Xbox and Steam. Additionally, this was the first Monster Hunter ever to release worldwide on the same day, and to have a bigger audience overseas than in Japan. You could chalk down the success to being mostly because of the worldwide multi-platform release, but the truth is that critics, returning players, and new ones all had heavy praise for the game's changes, with many even hailing it as the best Monster Hunter ever. That sentiment sort of eased as the honeymoon period ended, but the changes were very much appreciated and were widely seen as long overdue, and once positive word of mouth spread, even more people got into the game. In a sense, it might be safe to assume that Capcom achieved this success by westernizing the series. What began as simple mid-development measures in Full Ultimate have seemingly extended into the entire process, and World is the result, being a game that's very much catered towards Western players. But is it really that simple? The producers and director of World, the magnificent trio of Tsujimoto, Fujioka and Tokuda, frequently pushed back against this notion in interviews, using that exact word, Westernization. It's defined as the adoption of the practices and culture of Western Europe by societies and countries in other parts of the world, whether through compulsion or influence. And it's true, many of the changes World adopted are very popular among Western games, and they undoubtedly were influenced. The key word being influence, as they weren't forced to do this. But the developers claim that most of World's streamlining and major overhauls were actually a ripple effect from the decision to implement open, seamless locales. For example, the change to healing wasn't because the flex made people angry, but it relates to what Fujioka argued back in the Full Ultimate era. Being able to run away and load into a different area was, in his idea, a convenient failsafe that World no longer has. Monsters also have more advanced movement abilities and can follow you across areas. As such, being able to move while healing balances that out, and this action does have its own caveats. It's balanced by the healing itself being gradual. Once you've started the action, the potion gets used up too, meaning you can waste the heal entirely if you're interrupted. The goal of this game initially was to fulfill director Tokuda's long-term vision of creating a living, breathing world within Monster Hunter. However, two things happened that resulted in further overhauls. First of all, the way World was shaping up, they realised it would definitely have a really broad appeal. A big, exciting, detailed world, tough bosses and great visuals are all things that modern gamers go crazy for. It was a chance to go all in on the broader audience, especially with the larger Western install base of the systems they were developing for. But during this time, Full Ultimate sold really well in the West, the highest of any Monster Hunter game so far. In other words, it proved that this was a growth market. It showed that gamers of the West were more than willing to get into and enjoy Monster Hunter if they experienced a game that was at least mildly catered to their tastes. Westernizing Monster Hunter was never truly their goal. They were more or less redesigning the entire gameplay to account for the seamless maps, and taking the time to reevaluate every single aspect of the games, deciding what to add, keep or get rid of, but only within the context of what would make Monster Hunter World work. And herein lies the interesting part. Historically, many of the good streamlining additions they made in prior games were made to cater to the Western audience. The target camera, 4 ultimates reduced tutorials, even the suggested expanded hunter notes made it into World later on. By streamlining so much of Monster Hunter for this game, they arguably did westernize it, for better or worse, but not without care. Ryozo Sugimoto and co were aware that historically, Monster Hunter games had this perception of being absolutely fantastic games once you gave them a real shot and got to grips with them. It implied a very steep and unpleasant learning curve. It's like being recommended to watch a TV show that only gets good in the later seasons. Sure, you know it will become good later on, but do you really want to sit through the early pains? This applied to Monster Hunter to an extent, and so if Capcom were going to appeal to a broader audience this time, their job would be not to necessarily flatten the learning curve, but to streamline the entire process so it would be more enjoyable while retaining Monster Hunter's core identity. For example, a somewhat minor but persistent complaint of the older games was that monsters didn't have health bars, similar to traditional video game bosses, and playtesters wanted them added to World. Tons of video games tell you how much health their bosses have left, why can't Monster Hunter just be normal? But Sugimoto and co knew that it would make them feel less like natural creatures and would thus go against what Monster Hunter games are. So they didn't budge on this, but damage numbers on weapons were implemented as a compromise. Out of all the changes, Scout's Fly tracking is, from what I've seen, the only major overhaul that was intended to make the game easier. In this case, scrapping the old paintball system that would have people blindly running around looking for the monster for ages felt like a suitable choice. Scout Flies were much less confusing, incorporated monster ecology into the gameplay, and meshed very well with World's larger maps. Some changes were made specifically to account for a Western audience. This includes the addition of the SOS flare. Random online matchmaking is a staple of a lot of modern games today. The developers figured that Monster Hunter's traditional hub system, while still in the game, could feel alien and kind of long for some people, especially due to the need to set up a hub in advance before posting a quest. With the SOS flare, it was now very easy to either send out a join request or scour the quest board for something to do. Another change would be the addition of full voice acting. This was a staple of modern Western games at this point. If you want to appeal to them, you need this in your game. Plus, it heavily streamlines everything by reducing the amount of text one has to read, since you're mostly just listening. In short, while World wasn't wholly designed to appeal to Western players, a fair amount of design choices were made based on what they would find more enjoyable, especially after the success of 4 Ultimate's localization. The end result is that World was indeed a massive success. Monster Hunter's audience was now majority Western. It was also far bigger than before. Capcom now had a massive audience on their hands, which can be both a blessing and a curse. Monster Hunter Rise was released just 3 years after World. Being the very next entry, it carried over a lot of World streamlining, such as the changes made to healing, multiplayer, armor previews, and combat. The only real absence I can recall is the weapon guide on the top right of the screen, and this is likely a consequence of the game's target console not having a big enough screen. Rise was designed for the Nintendo Switch first and foremost, which has a screen much smaller than a TV. The Nintendo Switch is the key to understanding Rise. All of its strengths, shortcomings, and overall design choices were because of the system. The game was intended to be the ultimate handheld experience, something you could play in short bursts whenever and wherever you wanted. This resulted in Rise being much more streamlined than any other Monster Hunter game. Gathering was now even faster. World had of course sped it up already, but in Rise you can collect all ores and bones from veins and piles with a single respective button press. Rise also streamlined the preparation stage further by removing the need for hot and cold drinks. In every game up until this one, you needed those to negate the harsh temperatures of volcanoes, deserts, and tundras. Games like 4 Ultimate started including them in the item box by default, and World even placed the necessary gathering points to craft them in key areas. Rise omitted them entirely. One of the more controversial streamlining changes Rise made was the total removal of Scout's Flies and tracking as seen in Monster Hunter World. But the mechanic wasn't substituted with paintballs either. There was simply no tracking at all. Monsters were marked on the map at all times. Because Rise's streamlining was largely in service of having short gameplay sessions, speed was the name of the game here. Gathering was quickly sped up, so you could finish before heading to the monsters. Hot and cool drinks were cut, so you don't have to spend time stocking up, and monsters are marked all the time, so you don't waste any time searching for them. This philosophy extends to even more streamlining changes. For example, food and weapon buffs will remain after dying, unlike all prior games. Now you don't have to spend time eating again or drinking a max potion to get your stats back up. There's also a new action called the Wirefall. As said earlier, getting knocked down in Monster Hunter leaves you on the ground in an invulnerable state, and as a Thought Ultimate, you have a bit of time before you can choose to get up. The Wirefall lets you immediately swing back up in any direction, at the cost of becoming vulnerable and a lengthy Wirebug recharge. The addition of Palamutes is one of the bigger overhauls in Rise. They're mounts that can run fast, climb up vines, and fight alongside you. Every party member can bring one as well, and the locales are designed around them. As a result, you can all travel at high speed on the way to the monsters. Another overhaul is that multi and single player content will split once more. However, the village quests in Rise are basically an extended tutorial, and are designed to be much easier than even the older game's village modes. Hub quests once again have dynamic health scaling too. It's basically the approach of the pre-world games, but mixed in with that game's streamlining and more. For example, clearing the village quests, which are all low rank, will automatically clear the hub low rank quests, allowing you to skip what is basically repeated content and move on to high rank. Rise allows urgent quests to be completed for all players at once too, and key quests are also visibly marked, which is a very helpful change that the older games could have really done with. Other streamlining changes simply doubled down or expanded upon world's improvements. For example, Rise also has a training area. There's a mechanical dummy in Rises called the Toadversary, modelled off Tetranodon. You can have it fire projectiles or stomp on you, giving you ways of dealing with close or long range attacks. The sprint healing in World was balanced by the healing being gradual. Rise buffed it slightly, by having half the heal applied immediately. Rise expanded the hunter notes even further. Surprisingly, this game just lists the precise hit zones for each monster part, in addition to the precise drop rate percentages. Rise's menus were faster and snappier than World's too. Finally, Rise's biggest overhaul, which is more or less the elephant in the room: movement. The hunters are equipped with wirebugs, which are tools that let you grapple hook mid-air. Almost every single wall or cliff in the locales can be climbed too. This cleverly doubles down on world removing loading screens, because the ability to climb any mountain makes the locales more open than ever, and thanks to the great wirebugs, return of subcamps, and of course the palamutes, getting around is pretty damn fast. I would hesitate to call the wirebugs an overhaul, because I think everyone saw them as a major gameplay mechanic instead, and while they were praised and gave the game an extremely unique feel, some didn't really like them. In fact, Rise's streamlining at the time was quite controversial. Much of the choices surrounding the speeding up of the gameplay, such as the Wirefall, were believed to have made the whole thing too simple and much easier than its predecessors. World streamlining did generate a fair amount of discourse too, but the massive influx of new players sort of drowned it out. But many of those new players moved on to Rise, and were now uneasy with the additional levels of streamlining. To this day, I believe the most contested change was the total removal of tracking, which infamously led to some people dubbing Rise Monster Fighter. This stems from the feeling that Rise had become hyper-optimized around reaching the monster and fighting them to the death as quickly as possible, with everything else such as gathering or general preparation stripped away or streamlined down. Those aspects were sometimes derided or seen as long, but there was value in them. I said that Rise is best understood with the context that it's fundamentally a Nintendo Switch game at its core, even though it's on every platform now. It was built for that system. And what I meant by this is that Capcom did succeed at making a Monster Hunter game hyper-optimized for short bursts. If you pick up a Nintendo Switch, booting up the game and getting in a quick, satisfying hunt in under 15 minutes does work quite well. It came at the cost of a lot of the roughness of the series that people liked, but it achieved what it set out to do. And I believe this is something more people eventually realised and accepted over time. Again, Rise's streamlining was all in service of this goal, but not initially. The interesting thing about Rise is that it's structured like old gen Monster Hunter, but plays like new gen. This can be seen with the story and quest structure in particular. World's onboarding and difficulty curve were both meticulously crafted for both new players to learn the game and for experienced players to have a great time. With Rise, however, the progression is very much similar to a game like Portable Third or Generations, where it's just a list of quests after a list of quests. This is a consequence of the first 2 years of development. Rise initially was designed to be more like the 3DS or PSP entries in terms of visuals, but also gameplay, as it was going to retain the segmented areas of old gen. In 2018, however, Monster Hunter World happened, and its enormous success and critical acclaim made the Rise developers switch gears to try and adopt some of World's major selling points. such as the seamless locales and high quality visuals, and this also resulted in them adopting many of the quality of life additions and overhauls too. It was easier said than done, but they did achieve it. But this speaks to something interesting, in that they felt that not including World's various streamlining changes would be seen as a major step back, thus limiting the game's appeal. And to be honest, the mid-development pivot was justified. When Rise was announced, there was much jubilation at the confirmation of no segmented areas. Rise also sold really well, and as of this video, is the number 2 best-selling Monster Hunter game and Capcom game of all time. From this, you can draw the conclusion that once a mechanic is streamlined, it is very hard to unstreamline it, specifically if it's seen as an objective improvement. If the developers had stayed the course and released this 3DS style game in 2021, it likely would have been seen as a major step back for the series. Changing gears to make the game more like World, like it or not, was the correct decision. As for the more controversial changes, they were mostly begrudgingly accepted because many people saw Rise as some weird offshoot side project. World was Monster Hunter, Rise was Monster Fighter, and not the proper, true successor to the game they all cared about. Their successor would be Monster Hunter Wilds. In 2023, just 10 years after Ryozo Tsujimoto had been pondering how to get games like Ultimate to a wider audience, they had finally done it with World and proven it wasn't a fluke with Rise. And later that year, Monster Hunter Wilds was announced to be releasing in 2025, directed once more by Yuya Tokuda, with Konami Fujioka as art director, and with many of the same core staff once more. This was Monster Hunter 6, the long-awaited sequel to World. Interestingly, Ryozo Tsujimoto said in an interview that there was zero pressure from the success of Monster Hunter World when developing Wilds, and that they take each game as it comes. Wilds was primarily developed for the PS5. On paper, it was not as big of a gameplay revolution as World was, but it does overhaul some fairly major sacred cows, and in many ways it feels like several World concepts were doubled down on, and perhaps even truly realised on the stronger hardware. The biggest overhaul of Wilds is that villages, bases, and the hunting locale itself are now in the same loading space. You can now walk between them with no loading screens, and once again, this has led to some major effects. The first is a new quest type known as a field survey. If you start engaging with a monster while roaming the locales, a quest will begin automatically, and when the monster is beaten, you can skip the end quest timer, reward screen, and simply continue existing in the world. This is a major overhaul that completely streamlines the entire gameplay loop of Monster Hunter. This 20-year-long loop of accepting a quest, loading out to fight a monster, and then being sent back doesn't happen with this type of quest. It's been totally streamlined. It's safe to say that Wilds wants you to just be able to exist in the locales without forcibly being sent back to base after every hunt. In Wilds, meals now last a set amount of time and do not reset upon a quest completion, meaning a single meal can last you multiple monster hunts. In fact, you can now eat meals out and about whenever you want, even in the middle of a battle, at your own risk. Excess gathered items go directly to your tent, so you can stay out and gather for longer. You can also change the time of day and weather whenever you want. Finally, the quest handler always accompanies you, so you can accept a traditional quest no matter where you are. Wilds has much bigger maps than World, and so more streamlining changes were made in order to account for this. First of all, there's a new mount introduced for this game, the Sacred. This thing is multiple streamlining decisions in one. While it can't fight, it's far more capable than the Palamute. It can automatically take you to points on the map without the need to travel yourself, and this includes monsters. It holds a second weapon that you can swap out at will, eliminating the need to go back to camp and change one out, although you can still do that. Even Rise's wirefall mechanic is incorporated somewhat, as the Sacred can pick you up when you're downed. You can also collect quest supplies from it. The Sacred is pretty damn versatile, and the game expects you to be on it whenever you're travelling. As such, the Hook Slinger was added, which is a grappling hook that lets you snag most gathering items from medium range, except for bones and ores. It means you don't have to dismount the Sacred to pick most items up. This includes endemic life such as Vigor, Chill, and Heat Mantle bugs, which can heal, cool, or heat you up. Yes, the temperature mechanic absent in Rise is now back, with the drinks, but if you gather those two mantle bugs, you might not end up needing them. And now for something really interesting. Scout flies are back. The trails are thinner, and they still lead you to the monster, even though the Sacred can take you there on its own. But there's no need to collect tracks this time. All monsters are displayed on the map at all times, just like in Rise. Once more, there's combat streamlining, with some fun and very curious quality of life additions. Whenever a dangerous attack is coming, the health bar will go ballistic, kind of like a vitals monitor. It can be turned off if one finds it too distracting though. Buffs, statuses, and debuffs have timers on them now, and you can see how long they'll last. This also applies to elemental blights, poison, or stun. The radial menu has a new optimal healing option that will pick the right item you need at that moment. If your health is low, it defaults to Mega Potion. If it's mostly full, it will show instead of regular one. And if your health is full, it just won't do anything. One change I really like is that sharpening your weapon will now restore it in intervals based on the animation. In every prior game, it would all restore at the end. But in Wilds, every single stroke of the whetstone will restore a small chunk of sharpness. This means that cancelling the animation midway won't result in a total wasted effort, and during combat, you can often sneak in a little bit, even if the opportunity is too tight. Some heavy weapons now have built-in parries and some attacks that can knock back a monster's physical attack. Others have some really strong additions, such as the dual swords or bow, having perfect dodge mechanics. Then there's the more radical overhaul, Focus Mode. You can now manually aim every single weapon like it's a gun. This can be done mid-animation too, allowing for some wild pivots. The Clutch Claw from Iceborne has been streamlined into Wilds. This was a tool that allowed you to latch onto monsters and soften their parts, which would make them take more damage for a while. But in Wilds, the claw itself is absent. By attacking the same parts repeatedly, it creates a wound, causing the parts to take more damage like it would through the Clutch Claw. Deal enough damage and it bursts, often flinching the monster and granting you a material. The main campaign of Wilds is also extremely streamlined, with the entire low rank narrative being one major quest after the other in a rapid succession. The game is structured in such a way where it doesn't really want you to do much else until the final boss, where upon beating him will unlock high rank, which sort of opens the game up. Lastly, there's a few miscellaneous changes. To use layered armor in GU, you had to craft an additional set and infuse it with another set of armor, which was rather complicated. In World, it was a separate thing that was unlocked through the Guiding Lands. In Rise, you forged it through tickets, and this was also true for layered weapons in those two games. But in Wilds, all layered equipment simply unlocks as you forge it, which streamlines the process very nicely. When viewing a monster through binoculars, you can see their size, which is insanely useful for crown hunting if that's your goal. It can save you many hunts. Finally, certain field surveys can be saved as investigations, as mentioned earlier, and some of these will guarantee rewards like gems. No longer a random rare chance, this of course streamlines the process of grinding, which is something very critical to Monster Hunter. Once more, it would seem that the streamlining worked out fine, and did its job of helping the game appeal to lots of people. Wild sold 10 million copies in a month, easily Capcom's fastest selling game of all time. The critical reception, however, was rather mixed in certain aspects, and over time, sales flatlined. Wilds then only sold an additional million after a whole year, totaling to 11, which is highly abnormal compared to World and Rise, which remained consistent sellers for months and even years. A huge part of this was due to poor technical performance. The game ran badly for ages, was only recently fixed, and today is still rather heavy on hardware. However, it has to be said, the performance issues sort of acted like a lightning rod, and drew the thunder away from the game's other issues. Bad performance wasn't the only thing keeping people away, because in truth, if a game is good enough, I find most people will just brute force through the technical issues to play it. But this didn't happen with Wilds, and you can find a lot of discussions online talking about why. Beneath all the technical issues, people found the game easy. I mean, one could argue that this is very normal for new Monster Hunter games. Rise, for example, was also blasted for being too easy, as was World, as were many games in the past going back to try. It's a bit of an infamous cycle within Monster Hunter, but I would argue that Wilds is a unique case, because this is the first time I saw game critics unanimously agree that Wilds was just too basic, easy, and streamlined. I don't mean this to say, oh, Wilds is so easy that even game journalists are calling it bad. Game critics are a spectrum, and generally it's either a great or terrible sign when you start noticing common points of praise or contention in their reviews, such as Metroid Prime 4's talkative companions, being something basically all critics highlighted as a problem for that game. When the general public got their hands on it, they also agreed it was a problem. In the case of Monster Hunter Wilds, everyone seems to agree that the game wasn't challenging at all. I find that particularly significant because this didn't happen for World or Rise. Monster Hunter fans may have called them easy, but critics found them normal enough. Not so with Wilds, which means something was different here. Very recently, I saw a screenshot of a GameFAQs post on the Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate forum from someone claiming that the game was so easy and streamlined compared to Freedom Unite. What this user is saying about needing planning and focus to win in Freedom Unite compared to 4 Ultimate very much echoes future Monster Fighter arguments, which, as you may recall, was also used to put down Rise in opposition to World. Here it's being deployed to contrast much older games. In other words, it's not a new thing at all. In fact, one could argue Freedom Unite was the original monster fighter, seeing as it cut so many hunting elements from DOS, for better or worse. Nowadays, the monster fighter argument tends to centre more around getting to the monster, since it became extra prevalent after Rise ditched the scout flies. But 4 Ultimates and Freedom Unite have similar tracking, which means back then, the argument was around something else. The concept of hunting, which tends to consist of gathering and preparation, as we discussed in Chapter 1. As the series went on, it eased up on how much you have to actually do this in order to succeed at hunts. So one could reasonably make the argument that all but the first few games are Monster Fighter, since as discussed in Chapter 1, they all streamlined this process gradually, especially when you think about things like the farm. Monster Hunter 4 and successive entries were even designed to speed through tutorials and get you face to face with a monster as soon as possible. One of the core arguments behind Monster Fighter is, if you were to swap out the entire game and have it only be arena fights, would it really be that different to how it is now? The idea is that the games that get the label have little to no preparation and are just fight. Rise especially got hit with the Monster Fighter allegations because the entire game was designed for the purpose of getting to and fighting these monsters quickly. So people made the arena argument a lot, especially with how monsters are marked on the map at all times, eliminating the need to hunt or even find them. Now, I'm not trying to argue that every Monster Hunter game from 2007 has been Monster Fighter all along. My point is that for any of the games, people can make a very reasonable case, and they have been doing it for over a decade. But some cases are obviously much stronger than others, bordering on indisputable. For example, in Monster Hunter Wilds, displaying all the monsters on the map by default and removing the scout fly tracking once again really upset people. They had enjoyed the aspects of World, but, like Rise, just being automatically aware of which monsters were present and where they are sort of took some of the fun and mystery away from the game. However, I would argue that Rise would feel very much different if the game was just an arena. Wire bugging around the locales adds a lot to that game. It's a lot of fun, and even though monsters are marked on the map by default, the locale design encourages you to make your own way towards them by climbing over different mountains and parkouring, especially because you don't have scout flies telling you where to go. That's not to mention all the different useful items you can find scattered around. Wilds, however, does not have this strength, and it's entirely because of the secret. It just takes you to the monster with the press of a button. People have dubbed this thing the taxi or Uber because it might as well just be that. There's no need to explore the maps on your own because the secret will just take you on the best routes, allowing you to go on your phone while you wait. You can't even leave the secret behind, the game doesn't let you, and it's needed to change weapons, access quest supplies, and even critical secret only routes. As I said earlier, Rise's streamlining was criticised, but people eventually came to an understanding that this game was not the successor to World and was more or less doing its own thing. Many saw it as a weird spin-off, or distraction to the true sequel that would come later, and Wilds was very much billed and advertised as that sequel. So when Wilds released and didn't have World's track collecting, people were disappointed. And when it had a mount that was more advanced than Rise's Palamute and more or less played half the game for you, they got mad. And rightly so. Unlike Rise, Wilds did not have the excuse of being built for a portable on-the-go system, and it became very hard to argue that this game wasn't just Monster Fighter, it was the final form of the concept. At this point, they arguably could just cut out the middleman and replace all the locales with a single arena. It wouldn't even feel that different outside of aesthetics. Of course, one could argue that if you don't like the secret, then you should just ignore it, but that itself is difficult because of how baked into Wilds' game design it is. The interesting thing about Wilds is that on the surface, it would seem that most of the big changes were made due to the shift to even bigger seamless maps with connected hunting zones, villages and bases. That's where the field surveys, meal changes and more come into play. Yet, from what I've seen, field surveys are not even that liked among people, partly because they're a bit of a pain to do online, but also because the mechanic is streamlined within Wilds already. You can just save the monsters as investigations from the map, without even having to fight them first, and then complete them later as regular quests, which is far easier to do and allows you to play them with others at a moment of your own choosing. In other words, they made this whole new mechanic and then streamlined down any need to use it within the same game. Another weird streamlining change is the guaranteed gems from certain quests. Historically, these kind of gems were rare drops, like 1%, 3%, but World's investigations could often give you a higher chance of obtaining them. which felt like a decent compromise because grinding for these gems in the older games could take a long time. But Wilds went way too far in just guaranteeing them for you. All you have to do is just complete the quest. These drops being rare gave you more reasons to fight the monster, but because these gems are practically free, there's less reasons to do so. Wilds being too simple and frictionless is compounded by other issues. If World was sold on the idea that you'd get to hunt in this huge, living, breathing world, then this game was about surviving in the wilds. The field survey system was part of that, being able to start and finish a quest without often ever having to visit base camp. The weather system was another. The locales would shift from neutral to extreme to pleasant conditions on a regular basis. They presented this idea that you'd have to adapt to survive under sudden dangerous conditions. Sounds awesome having a new hazard to try and mitigate, but things didn't pan out that way. In the actual game, the weather pretty much only determines monster selection. The sand side of the Windward Plains is a massive thunderstorm, but it's mostly just an aesthetic difference. The lightning is unlikely to hurt you, and if it does, it's so negligible. The downpour in the Scarlet's Forest changes the whole look of the locale, but the extreme rainfall and flowing water does nothing to you. In Monster Hunter World, deep water at least slowed you down unless you had a counter skill, yet the downpour doesn't even do that. It feels as if this whole mechanic was streamlined before we ever even got a chance to experience it. In fact, that's true of actual mechanics that we did experience, like the subcamps. If you recall, World gave the ability to create more subcamps in certain safe zones around the locales. It was a great addition that encouraged us to explore and find them, while also cutting down on travel time. Rise brought them back where they function the same, but Wilds put a twist on the mechanic. There's now way more zones to place them in, and not all of them are safe. Some are right in the open, and monsters would destroy them if they noticed one in their territory. The risk was determining if the location to place a subcamp in was good enough to offset the possibility that a monster might make it unavailable. This was entirely patched out in Update 3. Monsters will no longer deliberately target subcamps. They can still destroy them, but you'd have to lure one in deliberately, streamlining in real time post-launch. And the mad thing is, I'm not sure if they did this because people complained that their camps were being destroyed, or because the mechanic wasn't great. Like in most cases, if a monster noticed your camp, you were usually in the middle of things. It's not a simple task to just drop everything and go sort it out, so 99 times out of 100, I would just let the monster wreck it. Well, no matter now, I guess. Something else that's interesting is you can teleport to camps whenever you want, in combat too. World and Rise restricted you from doing that, only with the Farcaster item where you were allowed to easily escape a monster. Wilds for some reason still has the Farcaster item, and it does the same thing, teleports you to the base camp, and I don't see the point of it at all. Why is it here? And then of course there's the combat. To reiterate, Wilds wasn't only blasted for being too simple, it was the first Monster Hunter that was unanimously criticised for being too easy. Some people blame focus mode. This mechanic is a weird one because, like Scoutfly tracking in World, it was deliberately implemented by the developers for the sake of making the game easier and more appealing to newcomers. Being able to aim any weapon like it's a gun does make combat easier. There are some that feel it's a major improvement to Monster Hunter's combat, while others believe it eliminates any need to position yourself when fighting the monsters. I do agree with the criticisms, but I do think it serves really nicely as a quality of life feature for when the monsters are flailing on the ground and you're trying to bonk them with a hammer. Being able to easily adjust to micro movements is really nice. It also shines for fights like Omega where he's always moving, but the hard pivots are definitely a lot and maybe should be curbed. And either way, it is slightly worrying that this was their idea of making the game more appealing to newcomers, but more on that later. I would personally argue that wounding is the far bigger issue surrounding Wilds' combat. Years ago, I criticised Iceborne's Clutch Claw in a video. It retroactively messed with World's combat and made it so you'd get a worse experience if you refused to use it, which wasn't helped by the mechanic not really working properly. I partly blame this on World not being designed for such a tool, as it was added with the expansion. Wild streamlines this mechanic so it's unavoidable, but much easier to use because the claw was completely removed from the equation. On paper, it should have been better implemented than it was in Iceborne. Instead, it was much worse. If you refuse to use the claw in Iceborne, fights would take a lot longer, but in Wilds, monsters at launch and throughout the base content more or less crumple into nothing. The wounds make them flinch, topple, all while buffing your weapons. It's so much free damage to the point I wonder if this was even tested properly. Surely this outcome was not what they wanted. I was genuinely seeing casual friends of mine getting speedrun level timings. Don't like it, don't use it, is a terrible argument, but the funny thing is you can't even refuse to wound monsters because again, of how the mechanic is baked into the combat. Essentially, Wilds heavily streamlined many of its new additions and introduced two extremely pervasive mechanics that really transformed both the combat and the traversal of these games very much for the worse. These alone contribute to the monster fighter feeling, but it has to be remembered that this game also inherits most, if not all, the changes World and Rise introduced, and I'd argue that they very much contribute to this feeling as well. I always believed that most monsters have never been able to keep up with our ability to run and heal. It's an absurdly strong option, and I honestly disagree with Konami Fujioka's opinion that it was necessary to account for not being able to flee easily anymore, because that's not something I ever really did, or witnessed anyone else do. Getting rid of the flex was probably the right move, but healing was too simple in World and easy in Rise, and naturally it's here in Wilds just as simple. But then there's things like traps and capturing. In the older games, they took ages to set down, and it was easy to be interrupted while doing so. If you were trying to capture the monster, you'd have to carefully watch for specific signs, like limping, and if you weren't careful, it was very easy to accidentally kill them, failing potential capture quests. Worse, if you placed your trap in the wrong place, and the monster immediately left the area, you'd be stuck for several minutes, as you'd have to wait for it to expire in order to place another one down. Even worse, you could miss your chance entirely to trunk bomb the monster, leaving you with no more traps and effectively soft-locking the quest. Capture quests were often really tricky, and it was a really interesting change of pace compared to the hunting quests, but there were also interesting workarounds to make things easier for ourselves, such as armor skills that allowed you to learn if a monster was capturable easily, and certain palicos could inform you too. There were also armor skills that allowed you to quickly set down traps, and of course, bringing extra materials could let you craft more if need be. Generation's ultimate allowed you to destroy traps you had placed down, which was useful for if you had placed one in the wrong spots. That was a nice change. But then World made some even more drastic changes. It massively sped up trap setup time and displayed a cute little skull icon next to the target camera display for when the monster was capturable, so those armor skills were now built in. And then Wilds retains those changes while also letting you pick up traps you had laid down. Not just that, but in this game, capturing a monster provides the exact same rewards as if you were to carve a monster. In the past, this whole mechanic provided a convenient option to end fights earlier than normal, at the cost of some tricky setup and a different reward pool. Now, it's extremely easy to do. There's basically no costs or downsides to pulling it off. So in Wilds Online, people will just capture anyone they can by default. Why wouldn't they? It's the best and easiest option. And of course, running out of traps or wasting them isn't really an issue anymore, nor is running out of items in general, all thanks to the ability to restock your items from camp. Long term, this has been one of the most contentious changes. Even back in Iceborne, people were calling it out as a potential problem. In the past, when out on a hunt, what you brought with you was all you had, and using your items up left you in a much worse position. You could bring extra materials to craft things like mega potions, but this took up valuable pouch space. In World, Rise and Iceborne, there's no risk at all to running out, because going back to camp and picking up some more is pretty simple. With traps in the older entries, the game could push against you with capture quests, but you could also push back with the armor skills, or by just bringing extra materials. By heavily streamlining this process, the game lost critical leverage it could use against the player. And it's the same story with restocking. The game can no longer make you worry about how many potions you have left, or whether you're using up too many antidotes, because going back to camp and grabbing more is downright effortless, especially in Wilds where there's no need for a Farcaster. Thinking back to Rise, it can be argued that a fair few of its streamlining changes were a knock-on effect of restocking, like the removal of the temperature system. Needing hot or cool drinks is no longer a huge deal, when you can just hop back into camp and grab them. Losing meal effects upon dying isn't a major issue either, when you can just dip into your large supply of ancient potions and pop one immediately. Both of these occurrences happen fairly frequently in World, and so to me, Rise's decision to streamline them made sense, but it also shows you how absurdly strong restocking is. World's armor system has also been a bit of a growing problem. Because of how easy it is to place skills on, you now have sets in Iceborne, Rise and Sunbreak with a whole page or two of skills, allowing you to rack up damage boosters or negate anything the monster throws at you. There's no negative skills either, so there's no consequences to configuring your set a certain way. It's pure power boosting, and Wilds has this problem too. In the past, if you were dealing with a monster adept with poison, your ways of pushing back were either bringing antidotes, which were often limited in quantity, and required you to consume them with an item flex or mid-battle, or equipping the negate poison skill, which was often tricky to add to your set without sacrificing something else. In the modern games, including Wilds, you can now sprint while consuming the antidotes and restock if you run out, and that's one threat gone. Antidote decorations are also very easy to apply, and 9 times out of 10, you won't have to sacrifice anything major. It's only 3 level 1 slots. And finally, A lot of weapons have been made really strong by successive additions that allow them to negate a lot of Monster Hunter effects. This is beating a dead horse, but a longsword parry is good enough to negate entire roars, tremors, hazards, any kind of monster attack. In 4 Ultimate, you had to either block or dodge through these, which often required additional armor skills to make them easy to pull off. And because of these strong weapon actions, there's no need to bring earplugs, tremor resistance, and you can rely on the counter to carry you through tons of different effects. Thinking back to Chapter 1, I've always felt the thrill of Monster Hunter was that the game was often quite rough to play, and the monsters had ways of making things difficult, but with preparation you could negate half of them and use skill to overcome the other half. But thanks to these cascading quality of life additions and overhauls, the game has lost so much leverage it used to have. It's no longer rough to play, but that means monsters don't really have much they can use against you, and if they do, it's so easy to negate. So many aspects of these games have been whittled down to nothing. What's even left? When you look at Wilds, the gameplay loop is essentially 1. Ignore the extremely cool seamless field survey and just save the monster as an investigation. 2. Press auto ride on your sacred and wait a minute. 3. Kill the monster in 5 minutes. 4. Repeat this 3 times and make the whole armor set because the investigation you saved has a guaranteed gem. It's just really boring. They streamlined the entire fun out of the game. And I know what people will say to this. Updates added a lot of difficult fights that aren't like this at all. 8 and 9 star tempers don't die in 5 minutes, are more resistant to wounds, and monsters such as Legiocris do not hand out gems like nothing. But steps 1 and 2 remain. And what you might notice is that these new fights are extremely hard. They're fast, have some very complicated attacks and combos. It's a real fight to the death. Keyword being fight. And because they don't have much leverage to whittle you down through other mechanics like item scarcity or tremors or other unique tactics, they all have to go extra crazy to stand a chance against you, with fast, high damaging attacks and combos. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, as these fights are very exhilarating, but it's something that's become more and more prominent for endgame hunts, and it results in all these monsters fighting kind of the same way. In other words, Wilds doesn't beat the Monster Fighter allegations. It's the only Monster Hunter so far where you can't really argue against it at all. The handling of Palicos is, I feel, the most ridiculous streamlining change they made for this game. Palico customization was one of my favourite parts of Monster Hunter, particularly in 4 Ultimates, Generations and Rise. There's a lot of different ways you can specialise them for different purposes, in ways that go beyond mere gear customization. By messing with their abilities you can change them into attackers, tanks, healers, gatherers, supports. Palicos often can't do all these things effectively, but they can become really good at 1 or 2. Even in World, sure the Vigor Wasp was very powerful, but if you wanted the useful Plunder Blade, you had to choose between them. Video games are a series of decisions you have to make, and the more interesting the decision, the more interesting the video game, and Palicos embody this quite well. In Wilds, it's all been streamlined. The Palico has numerous abilities at their disposal, and has access to all of them, at once. You can't choose to make your Palico a healer, or good at laying down traps or gathering, because it can do all those things. A later update gave you the ability to turn some of them off, but why would you? Why would you limit yourself? They all make the Palico so much more powerful and helpful, but also so incredibly boring. There's no more choice or decision making here. Why did they think this was better? I believe the Palico ability changes are a microcosm of their approach to Wilds in general, because this was not necessary at all. It completely removed any decision making from us, and therefore made them far less interesting to mess around with. This is true for so much of the game. Why did they give the Sacred the ability to go straight to the monster, with no input required from us? Why does the weather not matter? Why are there so few downsides to anything? There is a potential answer to this based on interviews, and I'm afraid it's not a great one. World streamlining was partly due to the massive gameplay reboot, but also because Capcom saw an opportunity to appeal to a mass audience. And they succeeded. They have the mass audience now, and with Wilds, the goal was to try and keep them. It appears that this time, the team were entering development with Wilds while assessing this massive player base they'd obtained with World and later Rise. More players meant a broader range of skill levels and tastes to account for. Fujioka said that World's success convinced them that they hadn't made any major mistakes when redesigning the whole gameplay, which emboldened them to go further with Wilds. But they were also concerned, because data showed that a lot of people who played World did not actually manage to finish the game. Based on public achievement data, less than half of all World players actually reached the Darklight Dragon. But Capcom has their own data through a process called telemetry. Do you know how games today often ask you if you'd like to opt in to anonymous automatic data feedback? If you say yes, developers get to track a lot about how you play, in ways they never could in the PS2 era. For Monster Hunter, a great example is those end-of-year roundups they do, when they show off all those crazy statistics like the most hunted monster, how many wirebugs have been thrown, the most and least used weapon. They can track things that wouldn't even occur to you. In the case of World, they use this data to figure out why people might have put the game down. They concluded that people had issues getting lost, not being able to find the monsters even with the scoutfly tracking, or not having the right weapon upon getting to them. Fujioka said he was aware that Monster Hunter is the kind of game that naturally won't be beaten or fully enjoyed by everyone. It's a 3D action game after all, but they still kept a lot of this in mind when designing Wilds. And to be honest, I think this accounts for a lot of the design choices in this game, and not even just the obvious ones. If you look at World's achievements, the biggest player drop-offs are all in the Ancient Forest segment of the game. This locale is infamous for being probably the most complex locale in the series. 4 levels of elevation, dozens of winding paths, zones, shortcuts. A very bold choice for an opening locale, but it resulted in a lot of people getting lost. So it would make sense that perhaps some dropped the game there. But then you look at Wilds' opening locale. By comparison, the Windward Plains has a very simple structure that's easy to memorize. So it's entirely possible that this was directly because of the Ancient Forest feedback. They felt that World's opening locale being too complex drove people away. But then you consider the developers' comments about people struggling with World's tracking system. That might be why monsters are just fully marked by default in the full game. Combine both of those concerns, and that's how you get the overbearing sacred autopathing. I think it's fairly safe to say that Wilds was both streamlined not only for the field surveys, but because for some reason they were utterly spooked by telemetry data and losing players. People had trouble exploring the maps, now a mount takes you around with no inputs needed. Had trouble locating the monster? They're all marked and the mount takes you to them. Struggling to choose palico abilities? You have them all. Had trouble aiming your attacks? Focus mode. Monsters keep destroying your camps? Well, now they won't. Whether too dangerous? It isn't, and maybe never was. Now it's impossible to get lost, struggle, or even really get inconvenienced. Now the game can be fun for everyone. I would say that from World onwards, Monster Hunter games have been designed so that most people can reach the final boss without any major obstacles. This manifested in World as a streamlined combined campaign. You can tell they put a lot of thought into the exact order of monsters players would encounter here. For Wilds they did the same to a greater extent. For example, Chatacabra and Chemetris serve as tutorial monsters, because the developers believed that the Great Jaguarus was too complicated for people with its 2 different states. So in Wilds, Chatacabra performs precise attacks, while Chemetris performs wide-reaching ones. I am a little bit baffled by the Great Jaguarus thing, but I do understand the decision to create 2 tutorial monsters, even if they're both undermined by the wounds. What I cannot comprehend, however, is why they bizarrely insisted on having every story mission be a walk and talk. These are gameplay segments in video games where you're forced to walk in a direction at a set pace, usually while accompanying a character. You have limited control, and they're usually done as a way of having dialogue without animating an expensive cutscene, all while having the player feel engaged and in control. They're particularly popular among Western game studios, and more Japanese ones have been adopting this technique in recent years. World had a couple of these, but most story missions would place you into the locale and lightly guide you around the different places through markers on the maps. You were very much still in control, but with Wilds, it feels like every other story mission forces you on the sacred, as it slowly travels to the story quest destination and requires you to listen to dialogue. I would argue that these are a lot worse than cutscenes, because those can be skipped while these cannot. The game is aggressively holding your hand because it can't seem to trust you to actually reach your destination on your own. Likely because again, the developers were too scared of people getting lost. Another example of hand holding or babying is that your companion doesn't really shut up and neither do you. I really like Alma as a character and the way our hunter talks, but the way they feel the need to comment on everything and point out so many different things is irritating. It was fine at first, but you can't turn this off or leave Alma at home. So even 200 hours into the game, she'll still be telling you that you can carve materials off severed parts. It's a little ridiculous how every minor thing needs to be pointed out to us, like we can't see it already. It's probably helpful for those who don't know how to play the game, but I'm not one of those people, nor are millions of others. The yapping is pervasive across every aspect of the game in ways I really don't like. When suppressing Elatrion's supernova in Iceborne, sure, there would be an NPC who told you, but the blazing black dragon made it clear with a cool sound and visual effects. In Wilds, Gogmazios shows no indication that his power has been suppressed, but an NPC just tells you about it. His fight is such an extreme microcosm of this whole approach. You're constantly being told about what to do and what's currently happening, and it's just way too much. You're not given the chance to work things out for yourself. It actually makes me dread what will happen if they bring back large-scale fights, like the Morans or Dalamadeur. Will an NPC tell us to get ready to dodge the super laser? Will they tell me when to hit the gong to repel the attacks? The fun was figuring all this out myself, or better yet, sharing tips with other hunters. But in modern games they don't trust us to do that at all. They're afraid of letting us fail. Constant dialogue is another staple of Western games. Characters that will comment on everything, just in case you yourself didn't notice, which can be helpful but more often than not ends up being really annoying, and takes something from the experience. It's like being told to do something you were already in the process of doing. All of a sudden, it's not your choice anymore. Another example of the game just holding your hand. This was infamously parodied in a recent viral video about a theoretical Western AAA Super Mario game. It was a funny video because Mario games are usually pretty cleverly designed, and Mario himself is a silent protagonist. Yapping companions doesn't really work for this type of game, and yet the dialogue sounded exactly like it would if a random Western AAA studio wrote it. You could make a reasonable case that Wilds is a Focus M game, and I don't think you could do that with any other Monster Hunter. Between this and the walk and talks, it would be fair to say this whole thing is another example of Westernisation, but things are a lot different to how they were 10 years ago. Monster Hunter 4's Westernisation had the developers figure out that Western gamers were older and smart enough to figure out video games, and that they didn't like or need to be treated like babies. 3 Ultimate gave us 50 additional free but mandatory defense points because they assumed we'd find the game too hard, but they correctly realized that was a mistake after Backlash. They decided it would be better to reduce tutorials, in order to waste less time learning about things we already knew, which was undoubtedly the right move. Wilds' Westernisation seems to have taken the opposite approach, and instead aggressively holds your hand, with unskippable walk and talks and dialogue in fear of you getting lost, not knowing what to do, and dropping the game before you beat Zoshia. They went from appropriately assuming we were more than capable of rising up to a challenge, to appealing to the lowest common denominator. Andrew Alfonso suggested his 4 Ultimate changes, with both experienced and new players in mind, yet Wilds from the ground up seems overwhelmingly designed for the sake of newcomers. Why did this approach completely flip in 10 years? Part of me wonders if it's that back in 2014, they were working with feedback that came from players, while in the modern day it's maybe based more on raw statistics. But it could also genuinely be due to influence from Western game techniques and methods, which have become so ubiquitous that the Focus M video could have been about any one of them, and sadly, it very much applies to Wilds. In late 2025, at the PlayStation Awards, Wilds' 4th major update was on the horizon, and Tokuda talked about how they had intentionally streamlined Wilds. We analysed what kind of places beginners were stuck in, including Monster Hunter World. We have worked on these points in turn to make it easier for new users to clear hurdles, such as being able to reach certain monsters or craft certain types of armour. In addition, we have tried to adopt as many new elements as possible that are beneficial for both beginners and existing users, such as Focus Mode. This time, as a result of making the game easy to beat even for new players, and players who could not clear it before, I think the difficulty curve was a little lacking for existing users. At this point in time, they were trying to add harder content to the game in response to very harsh feedback over the months, and Tokuda asked people who had dropped Wilds to give it another try. But this does make things extremely clear. They streamlined Wilds severely after getting spooked by player drop-offs in World, and more or less admit that by focusing on those who couldn't clear World, they made the game too easy for everyone else. This quote is the smoking gun that more or less vindicates everything we've discussed. However, I saved it until now, because Tokuda made this statement after Wilds' sales had flatlined and many months of negative reviews, based on how streamlined the game was. It's an honest apology and explanation, but I instead felt it was better to take pre-release interviews into account when analysing why Wilds turned out this way. The reason is, right after this statement dropped, tons of people on social media were going, See? They admit it! They admit they made Wilds easy! But as I've shown in these old interviews, I don't think they really hid this aspect of Wilds in the lead up to launch. They openly talked about how they closely analysed World during Wilds' development, and that features like Focus Mode had been added purely for new players to have an easier time. The difference is, those statements were made before we played the game, while the developers were still riding off the success of Monster Hunter World and Rise. But the apology was made after Wilds' harsh decline. The different contexts are interesting to me for this reason, and why I chose to focus on the earlier interviews. Either way, there it is. They were too concerned with newcomers and people who dropped World, and tailored the entire launch experience around them to make sure they'd actually finish Wilds. I don't even know if this fear was justified. Over 40% of people reached the Nojiva in Monster Hunter World, which, based on the achievement rates of a lot of games, is above average, and I don't think it should have been cause for panic. World and Rise reviewed fantastically without all this stuff. Hell, forget Monster Hunter. Elden Ring sold like 30 million copies, and that's a game that throws you to the wolves pretty much. That is not a mass market, focus tested game at all, and did insanely well despite, or maybe because of that. The hand-holding and yapping companion is especially weird to me, because even Nintendo figured out that this stuff is toxic years ago. Ocarina of Time in 1997 introduced a companion called Navi, who would give you tips and guide you in case you weren't sure where you were going. Navi became a bit of a meme for being a bit overbearing, although I never found her bad, but Fi in 2011 Skyward Sword was particularly scorned for constantly interrupting the gameplay to tell you what to do. Nintendo had no faith in the players figuring out the game on their own, and the game is particularly infamous for it to this day. So for Breath of the Wild, Link was not given a companion in response to the Skyward Sword criticism. Breath of the Wild sold 34 million copies, and is widely regarded to be one of the greatest games of all time. The Legend of Zelda learned a harsh lesson from overbearing companions, so they ditched them entirely for the next main entries with no consequences. So what on earth possessed Capcom to not even let us turn off Alma's dialogue, let alone have her constantly hold our hand? I have no doubts that World's audience has heavy crossover with games like Elden Ring, yet Capcom seemed to favour the more general Horizon Zero Dawn crowd instead. It's such an unforced error that screams of insecurity. Contrary to what they said in pre-release interviews, I do not believe they were confident when designing this game. If they were, then World's success should have been a justification to increase the challenge for Wilds, which to me implies the challenge is not why they think World did so well. Their goal was to double down on what they think made World successful, and of course, to aggressively address whatever they think made people fall off that game, and the answer to both is even more streamlining. What we see in Wilds is the result. And were they successful? On paper, yes. Wilds has an extremely high achievement rate for not only low rank Zoshia, but the high rank Arkveld Urgent, which is more or less the final boss of the game. They were successful at making sure people at least finished the story, but it came at a cost. Wilds was sold on being the sequel to World. Identity wise, this whole game is just World but bigger, and more realised for the PS5. It was heavily marketed as the successor, and everyone saw it as that. That's why it sold 10 million in a month. So where does the drastic fall-off come from? When a product, or person, or video game tries to appeal to a mass audience, they can't afford to alienate people with things like strong opinions, statements, or perhaps even tough video game mechanics, so they try and keep things rather basic and easily digestible. This is more likely to get a large amount of people to enjoy the thing, but it has the adverse effect of not really being special or really resonating with people deeply and often feeling shallow. The experience simply doesn't really sit with them. On the other hand, something that targets a specific niche can definitely put some people off, but it can also likely resonate even more with the people that do like it, at the cost of the overall audience being smaller. You may have noticed the chapter names. A game for everyone is a game for no one is the motto of Arrowhead Studios, who are behind the Helldivers games among others. This quote symbolises something similar to what I said, that designing something to appeal to as many people as possible ensures that it has to be fairly bland and inoffensive. But carrying out your own unique vision and making something special can attract a perhaps smaller audience, but one that enjoys your work much more, even if it deters someone else. Here's a hypothetical scenario for you all. Imagine a video game. Perhaps a 3D action game where you kill bosses. The game may have a system where you don't know where the bosses are on the map, but they've left tracks, and by picking up those tracks, you can learn where they are and then chase them down, getting a better idea of their habits and unique traits in the process, and ultimately making these bosses feel more natural. It's nothing too complicated, but it's not something that other action games have really done, and it makes this one really stand out, which results in people really vibing with it. Now imagine if there were other people that found the system confusing and kept getting lost on their way to the bosses. Let's say the developers decide to cater to those people and remove the system entirely in the sequel while failing to replace it with anything better. In theory, everyone can enjoy the sequel now, but in practice, the guys that loved the system in the prior entry are now annoyed that it's gone and feel the sequel isn't as special. The developers tried making a game for everyone but ended up alienating a lot of people. But what of those they were catering to with this omission? Wilds was the very first Monster Hunter game to be designed with the knowledge that over 10 million people purchased the previous one. The mass market was a huge concern this time, and it shows. So Capcom were ultimately able to make a game that appealed to them all, which is why the rate of completion is so high. But arguably, this strategy failed. There's a reason the game isn't really selling all that well compared to how World or Rise were doing. It's not even because of the $70 price tag, because it regularly sells for less. Look, I purchased this in October for £16, and I don't even have a PS5. New games don't get cheap that fast if there's actual demand for them. The simple fact is that the drastic fall-off comes from either bad word of mouth or no word of mouth. Wilds simply didn't resonate with people to the same degree as World or Rise, and thus isn't that special to them. And it's all because Capcom streamlined the game so much so they could appeal to the mass market. Because fundamentally, Arrowhead Studios are correct. A game for everyone is a game for no one. That hypothetical sequel we discussed earlier wasn't as special as its predecessor. And it doesn't leave a lasting impression on neither the people that cared about the original or the people who bounced off it. Why would even casual players care about a game that doesn't challenge or push them in any way? They'll simply breeze through and move on to something else, failing to establish a natural connection with the experience. Earlier we discussed how Ryozo Tsujimoto and other Capcom staff believed Monster Hunter games historically had an issue where they were viewed as really good games, but only once you got to grips with them. They saw this as a problem that limited the appeal of the games, and let's be honest, they were correct. The learning curve was fairly steep, which made a lot of people bounce off the games. By flattening it slightly for World, they managed to appeal to way more people who all enjoyed the game, which propelled it into being their biggest success ever. The deal with learning curves is that if they're steep, sure, some people will be driven away. But the people who do actually get to grips and engage with them may have an even better time. The struggle to learn and improve makes the experience special. This is why the Soul series completely blew up, and in regards to Monster Hunter, even though I, and a lot of old gen players found World a bit easy, it's safe to say they struck a fairly good balance that did actually resonate with a huge amount of people. But they doubled down too hard, and they led to Wilds having a really unbalanced curve, because the update monsters are so much harder compared to the bad launch, that things go from 0 to 100. But this still doesn't change the first impressions of millions of people, nor does it affect the Monster Fighter allegations. We do really have to wonder why World's completion rate spooked them so badly, considering it's well above industry standards. Scarlet Nexus is one of my favourite 7 out of 10s ever, and that game has a 20% completion rate, despite only being 20 hours and not particularly difficult. World's campaign is 40 hours and much more difficult, yet the rate is more than double that. I suspect that, going from the 3DS to the PS4, this may have been their first real exposure to feedback from telemetry data, that I suspect they weren't really getting from 4 Ultimate or older games. The data is so precise and is very different from the feedback they would get from surveys, giving them exact information on player habits and tendencies, which heavily spooked them and made them overthink how people actually engage with the games. I myself sometimes go through something similar when I see the viewership charts of certain videos. It is very easy to be spooked by seeing massive drop-offs. I'd also say that a fair few of the statements they made pre-release simply do not ring true when you actually look at how Wilds turned out. Fujioka said that they were aware that a game like Monster Hunter would always have stragglers that would quit the game prematurely, and that they had accepted this. Yet this was obviously something that was hugely concerning to them. Him saying that World's success assured them that it hadn't made any mistakes when overhauling Monster Hunter's gameplay doesn't really mesh well with how drastically they streamlined Wilds even further, removing things that people liked about World for the sake of convenience. And of course, Ryozo Tsujimoto saying that they felt zero pressure from World's success. Let's be honest, they felt a ton of it. Ultimately, Monster Hunter Wilds is proof that even normal, casual gamers do not vibe with Monster Hunter games that just yield to them with little to no pushback. Challenge and even some amount of friction is what keeps the experience memorable, keeps them coming back to it, and keeps them talking about it. And Wilds is the consequence of so much streamlining over the course of so many entries. It's all led up to this, the ApoQOLypse. The thing about Monster Hunter Wilds is that as an action game, it is extremely solid, especially once the updates rolled in with the higher difficulty options. But it's clear that at this point, all the massive overhauls have cascaded into a game that undeniably feels more like Monster Fighter than even Rise. As we discussed earlier, Wilds feels like it could have been a fairly harsh experience. When you think about things like the extreme weather that ended up being inconsequential in particular, maybe Wilds was going to be a serious hunting simulation that was heavily streamlined mid-development out of fear of alienating casual players. On the other hand, it's also extremely likely that the game was just intended to be this way from the start, and I don't know which possibility is worse. Either way, the excessive streamlining definitely finally removed the feeling of being a proper monster hunter, which is something that set the series apart from being any average action game. I say finally, because it's clear that this has been happening for far longer than some people might assume. It is however telling that Wilds actually excels at being monster fighter. The monsters themselves are still creative, with interesting attacks, designs, armors, weapons, the combat is fun and the endgame fights are exhilarating. The development team may have lost the plot, but they have not lost the source, and I believe they are aware of this. The really fascinating thing about Wilds, to me, is the long-term lessons Capcom will learn from it. We're already seeing behaviour shifting. Both Pragmata and RE9 launched with Capcom insisting and assuring people that the games would run fine even on low-spec hardware. I think they're going to keep doing this with their future games, and it's because Wilds broke people's trust in Capcom's ability to make a stable video game. But from a gameplay standpoint, if Capcom designed Wilds this way because World was a breakout success, then how will they design the successor to Wilds? This question of course depends on if you can argue that Wilds is a financial flop. Because let's be real, most studios would kill for 10 million sales ever, let alone in a single month. But it's clear to me from things like the Guild reports that Capcom were not happy with how Wilds sold after its first launch month, that they consider it flatlining to be a serious problem. Their strategy with games is to have them sell consistently for months and years on end, which has worked very well for World, Rise and all their Resident Evils. But their strategy failing to take hold with Wilds is something they've clearly noticed. So the answer to this question is that Wilds didn't flop, but it's not doing particularly great. And so from a gameplay perspective, if the biggest criticism of Wilds is almost entirely centered around the game being too easy, streamlined and not feeling like a Monster Hunter game, then how will future entries be designed with that in mind? I would say that the priority for the future should be bringing that feeling back, and I don't expect it to happen with Wilds. This might be presumptuous to say, but mechanics like the Sacreds feel unsalvageable. I would also caution those who, for some reason, believe the successor to Rise will somehow be the complete opposite of what Wilds is in regards to monster hunting, or fighting. I would only expect such a course correction to happen with Monster Hunter 7. And honestly, it seems like the best solution would be to start stripping back our own capabilities again. It can definitely be argued that World struck a really nice balance between not being as rigid as the older games while still having plenty of hunting, and Rise was arguably proof that the developers couldn't really walk any of it back without major backlash. But now that everyone knows what an uber streamlined Monster Hunter looks like, seeing how Wilds went so far with it, I think Capcom could easily get away with course correcting hard, stripping things down to even before World. But hopefully not that far back, because I'm not really enjoying Monster Hunter Freedom. For me, the games strike an appropriate balance around 4th gen, but I wouldn't really want to go back to that either, not precisely. When I look at how Wilds is designed, I seriously get the impression that Capcom wants to make an open world Monster Hunter game in the future. I don't believe they wanted to do it with Wilds. I think the goal with this game was to essentially redo World on better technology. But when you look at systems like the field surveys and the changing weather, this is exactly what would be in an open world game. A lot of people are extremely averse to an open world Monster Hunter, because a lot of long running game series that try it don't do it particularly well, seen recently with Metroid Prime. But honestly, I think Capcom are capable, and this is the perfect chance to course correct away from Wilds and make the gameplay actually harsh. If Monster Hunter 7 had you legitimately in the wilderness away from civilization on your own, without many of the luxuries we've gotten used to in recent games, I think it could be very special. I want something of a reset basically, and I do have some thoughts on how things could be dialed back. World, Rise and Wilds have made gathering easier than ever. It's faster, and with the hook slinger you can even grab stuff from a distance. It makes picking herbs, honey and more a very simple task. The auto-crafting feature added in World is really handy too, because if you're on the lookout for honey, you can easily refill your mega potions. So I think it's finally time for restocking to go, purely because of how easy it is to gather. If people need more potions, they should memorize where herbs are and gather them on site. I would also welcome a return of a proper tracking system, but not World Scout Flies. I've always felt that while they were better than paintballs, they're not elegant at all. It's dynamic yellow paint, following a giant glowing arrow, as if the game can't trust you to find your own way to the monster. From that standpoint, even though Rise tells you where the monster is, I find it does handle this better, purely because you make your own way over, which is important because Rise has a lot of choice between the game's various movement options. There just has to be a better way of figuring out that first step, learning where the monster is exactly, because getting some kind of direction is critical for large locales. What I do like about the Scoutfly system is the way you start off having to find tracks and after several hunts, the system becomes automated. I just think that there's probably a better way of figuring this out that they should have done for Wilds, instead of just throwing it all away. The armor reworks were smart, but I think there was something interesting about the negative skills that we lost in New Gen that I wish could come back in some way. There should be something to push back against when crafting these sets that makes it a little tricky to fill out entire pages. Wilds brought back the temperature system, but it's so nothing that they could have omitted it and little would change. But something like this is important. It's just clear they need to figure out a new system that doesn't require us to just bring a consumable item. For example, Breath of the Wild allows you to equip elemental weapons to offset harsh temperatures. A future Monster Hunter doesn't have to copy that, but it shows there are a lot of possibilities that they can explore. Most importantly, I do want them to dial back our combat capabilities. I think that we are just too strong. The problem with this is it relates to the difficulty of these games, something that is spotty during the base game but evens out with the expansion. Wilds' master rank will surely increase the difficulty, but I wonder if it would be better if some of the strong weapon capabilities were saved for the expansion. Dual swords having a free perfect dodge that buffs us, for instance. I think longsword's parries being able to dodge everything, while very fun, has never been good for the games, especially when it comes to effects like tremors or roars. They don't feel important anymore. It ties back to what I said about monsters having no leverage against you anymore, which homogenizes every difficult fight into the exact same strategies. There's changes made in World that are very good common sense additions, and those I would love to remain. Joining ongoing quests, dynamic health scaling, hunter's notes, and I do really enjoy the combat of Wilds, not to mention a lot of the changes it's made, including the sharpening adjustments, meals carrying over, and everything surrounding field surveys. In fact, I wanted to talk about this earlier, but support hunters are fantastic, especially when it comes to fights that require multiplayer. Omega Planetes is my favourite fight in the game, and that simply wouldn't be the case without those fairly competent NPC companions that allow me to fight him whenever I want without getting a coordinated group together. What's cool is they do contribute to health scaling, so there are pros and cons to bringing them along. I have to give major props to Capcom for this one, but so much of these other streamlining changes have got to go for the games to get better. I think Monster Hunter 7, if they play their cards right, could legitimately be a very solid survival-esque game that requires you to overcome many different factors in order to win. And maybe it won't be open, for better or worse. Maybe it will be structured like Wilds, or even more traditional, but I still think they need to course correct away from this game's extreme streamlining to avert the apocalypse. Monster Hunter games were initially streamlined at first to reduce brutal mechanics and make the game slightly easier in ways that retain the core appeal of the games. With Monster Hunter 4 onwards, the streamlining was instead to expand Monster Hunter's audience in the West, which involved things like cutting down tutorials and not babying players. This was successful, and with World they finally went global by overhauling the entire gameplay to both have open maps and to try appealing to a mass audience on the PS4, but they were always concerned about keeping Monster Hunter true to what it was. Monster Hunter Wilds, however, appears to have been streamlined both due to the new field survey system, but mostly out of fear of losing the mass audience that World had been introduced to. It features heavy amounts of hand-holding, and several interesting mechanics were made simpler, resulting in them becoming boring. This all backfired badly too, resulting in a game that, while extremely solid, lacks a lot of what makes Monster Hunter special. Even casual players find the game too simple and streamlined, and it's clear that Capcom went too far this time. This feels like such an unforced error, and I don't think Wilds needed to be sanded down to this degree. It could have kept a large audience, and World is proof of that, remaining to this day as not only the highest selling game in the series, but also one that is still consistently praised. I would also argue that Rise is proof that people will accept extreme streamlining if there's a strong reason behind it, and it can allow the game to explore other things. Wilds does not have a strong reason at all. Even across the industry, games like Elden Ring and Breath of the Wild refused to baby players and were successful. And I'd argue the success didn't come in spite of them not aggressively handholding, but because people respect games that treat them like competent individuals that know what they're doing, and they respect games that let them get on with things and figure stuff out on their own. Of course, if you go too far with that, you can create a frustrating experience, but World and Iceborne were not that at all. Well, okay, maybe a little, but it wasn't anything people couldn't push through and overcome. This video has been in the works since December of last year, but what really affected my opinion when writing it on or off was the release of Monster Hunter Stories 3, Twisted Reflection in March. Surprisingly, this game was a lot harder than the first two. You really had to pay attention to what the monsters were doing and prepare accordingly, paying serious attention to their patterns in order to not die, making sure to never waste your head-to-head opportunities. Stories 3 did have a lot of streamlining changes compared to the first two games, yet it was for the sake of exploration and being able to collect more eggs for the habitat restoration feature. the combat was still hard, and the game remained just as, if not more interesting than the first two entries. I wondered why the developers of Stories 3 had made this game so hard when Wilds was easy and simple by comparison. But then it occurred to me, Stories 2 sold 1.5 million, which is major for a turn-based RPG, but small potatoes compared to World's 25 million and up. In other words, the Monster Hunter Stories series is niche, while the main series is fully mainstream. Stories 3 can afford to be hard because it has an audience that is more likely to stick through and keep engaging with it. But with the audience Wilds was aiming for, the developers felt that they couldn't afford to do that and had to make it simple, to maximise the chance that people would reach the final boss. This was more or less said verbatim by the Wilds developers in interviews, and it really blackpilled me in a way. Are all the games going to be like Wilds in this regard from now on? Is Monster Hunter a victim of its own success? Now, I don't say this with glee, but with how Wilds has done financially, I'm a little more optimistic now, and I think we will see a course correction. Similar to how Capcom are very insistent on the stability of their recent games after Wilds, I believe they may also see such an extreme willingness to streamline Monster Hunter as toxic. Capcom and the Wilds developers are very much aware that this game went too far, and I believe if the course correction doesn't come with the expansion, it will most certainly come with Monster Hunter 7. Some of you may see this video as extremely negative towards Wilds, and perhaps the opposite of my review from last October where I was by all accounts fairly positive and even defensive towards the game, so much so that some people got very annoyed at me for it. I still stand by pretty much that entire video, except for it being too long. It shouldn't have been 3 hours, and I very much tried to keep pacing in mind for a lot of my recent videos, but I still believe in most of what I said there. In this video you might have noticed, I frequently point out that Wilds is a solid action game. It's a very fun game, but with things like the launch state and the secrets, I do believe this is the first game to fully earn the Monster Fighter title, in the way the others don't. In fact, 9 days after the game launched, I tweeted this. When you consider that Wilds is indisputably the easiest game in the series, the way our Hunter and Armor constantly comment on everything, the QTE power clashes, the glowing weak points after big attacks, etc., it all becomes clear. Capcom wants the Horizon Zero Dawn audience. In a way I was both right and wrong. Capcom didn't want the Horizon Zero Dawn audience. They already had them, and were deathly afraid of losing them. But the truth is, this audience was mostly more than happy with how World Streamlining was. They like Monster Hunter for Monster Hunter. I don't think there was a huge need to double down to this degree with Wilds. I don't expect the expansion to really fix it either, because you can't walk back so-called quality of life additions. Like, what are they going to do about the Sacred, realistically? I think it's going to be very fun, high quality and difficult, but the ApoQOLypse will continue until we get a game that has a chance to learn from the reaction to Wilds. Thank you for watching this video. Long essays like this are not easy to make. You may wonder why I left out this streamlining change, or this overhaul, or this quality of life addition, but the truth is, I noted every single one I could think of, but a ton were left out for the sake of time and pacing. I'm also well aware that the kind of things I'm talking about are tricky subjects that can really draw out emotions in people. For those who like Wilds, dislike Wilds, like how Monster Hunter has been, aren't satisfied with the current direction, and I try and be conscious of that. This video has been in the works for months, and the script went through many different revisions and totals to over 21,600 words. If you'd like to support me further, I'd really appreciate it if you donated to me on Patreon. Doing so will get you access to an exclusive video every month, all prior exclusive videos, early access to videos, being credited at the end of every video, and you also get to support the creation of videos like this in the future. I really hope you enjoyed it, and would be interested to hear in what you take away from the whole thing, or think about the topic of streamlining. Next month, I plan to release the video you've all been waiting for. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a good day.